Hi everybody, so this is my last video on comparative essay writing for Edexcel A-level prose unit, and so for us that's Frankenstein and the Handmaid's Tale, and we've already looked at planning your essay, we've looked at writing introductions, we've looked at how you can open your comparative essay paragraphs, and then we've looked at the importance of signposted AO2, your analysis of language form and structure. And so for us with this particular exam, the other AO that is marked and equally weighted is your ability to interweave your context. And so that's looking at the influence on the writer or the text or the events in the text of the social, historical, biographical context, and we'll get into that as we go. So let's start off, as I have been, with all of these essays with my, all of these videos with my caveats. And so this is, I've called this one Whiskers Frankenstein. This then is, as I've said with all of my other videos, there are many different ways to structure your essay paragraphs, to write your essay paragraphs up. I've talked in the past about how some essay paragraphs where you've got really interesting textual references that you want to dig into can be more heavily weighted towards AO2 analysis, and some paragraphs where you want to deal maybe with some of the big overarching events in a text can be weighted more to a discussion of context. And so this isn't just about your paragraphs being like a Lego wall where, you know, you put your idea in and then you put your textual reference in and then you put your analysis in and then you put your context in and then you transition onto the second text and you do the same over and over again. What you want to show is a really deep understanding of how the text is influenced by the context, how it's tightly linked to the author's purpose and their intention, and you want to show how that context is linked to what's going on in the text. And sometimes you can do that just by name checking. And with The Handmaid's Tale, the regime of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania is a really good example. Because that's unpacked for us in the historical notes, you don't need to regurgitate dates and facts. So it's something that when you talk about the perhaps Offred's visit to the doctor, or this kind of this overly medical focus on a woman's ovulation whilst rejecting all sorts of other kind of medicine and science, you can just name check the Ceausescu regime in the 1960s in Romania, and you don't need to unpack that into a lot of detail. But if we were sticking with The Handmaid's Tale, then you can't name check the moral majority or the Christian right. That does need unpicking, and it does need to show a level of social and political understanding by you that is brought out in your discussion of both what Atwood is, her intention is in terms of critiquing America, but also the specific events and language in the text. All right, so the caveat is there are loads of different ways that you can add your context in. I will talk through some of them, but as long as you are linking your context tightly to the author's purpose and the author's intention, you are probably heading in the right direction. All right, so let's crack on. So what we're going to cover today then is why do we need to discuss context? What's the importance of it? How do we choose the context that we're going to use? And what contextual elements for both Frankenstein and The Handmaid's Tale can you use? So that's a kind of revision checklist, and then some different ways and different strategies for embedding context. And obviously you can come back and go over this video, but there are some screens that you may want to do a screenshot of to have with you as you complete your comparative essay for me. All right, so why context? So we've talked about this, but let's just make sure we've got it really clearly in our minds. So nothing exists in a vacuum, in isolation by itself. Every piece of art is somehow born out of the context in which it is created. So there is no writer who is able to cut themselves off from their upbringing, their education, their family circumstances, the life events that they've experienced, the culture that they've experienced, the positives and negatives in their life. And so we can't cut ourselves off from them. And so when we look at context, what we need to look at then is how then are the texts that we're reading influenced by all of those different things. And I've outlined some of them here for you. So I've said, as I've already said, we've got cultural context in terms of the kind of the dominance, the majority culture that a writer or exists in, or a text is existing in, and what its relationship with that dominant culture is, whether it's minority or isolated within that. You've got, again, the pervading religious atmosphere of a period. And so we've talked about with Frankenstein about the idea of religious thought being much more kind of socially normalized than it is, say, in Britain today. And so people would have, you know, considered the idea of things being morally right and wrong, being good and evil, in a way that we don't particularly use the same language today. Then we've got biographical context, we've got philosophical context, our own personal beliefs in the same way, and that kind of links a little bit to the idea of political context, which also is kind of social and cultural as well. You know, some people are more left-wing leaning, some people are more right-wing leaning, some people are agitators and very active and very kind of they might be opinionated. Some people in terms of their own philosophy are you know, peacemakers. And so we have all of those different things that can influence texts. Then we have the genre of the text itself and how that influences the text. And of course, we have, to a certain extent, Mary Shelley creating the genre of science fiction. But Mary Shelley didn't sit when she was in the villa in Geneva and go, I'm going to invent a new genre. So she's writing in a mode of writers that she aligns herself with, and so we can draw threads from that. We've also then, in terms of genre, also got the literary tradition, and we've talked in other videos about the idea of postmodernism, and so in that sense, that and romanticism, we've got that sense that there is this kind of literary tradition that writers are writing into, and they're influenced by that to varying degrees. Different parts of it are foregrounded for them because of their own particular interests, and other parts are ignored. We've got historical, social, political context as well, and it's really important that we think about these with reference to text, and we think about them carefully, because some pieces of context are intentionally mined by authors, and The Handmaid's Tale is a real gift to us as students for that, because Atwood she kind of waves a flag for us, pointing out what's going on in post-war global society that she has mined. So she talks about environmental disasters. She talks about, you know, abortion. She talks about women leaving the kitchen and going out to work. And so she intentionally has selected these threads of social history and woven them into the text. And we can explore why that is, what she's mined these things for to tell us. Because she hasn't mined everything. And so what she has chosen has been chosen with a purpose. And so there are elements that are mind on purpose. With Frankenstein, we know, because we've read it in Mary Shelley's own introduction to the novel, that she on purpose has mined this emerging science, this use of electricity to reanimate. And we've got Galvani, and we've got Polidori, who was the scientist that was present at Lord Byron's mansion, giving her some really specific emerging science knowledge that she's mined. And remember, she has this nightmare that is the genesis of this story, and she wakes up realizing that actually scientific progression isn't necessarily the enormous bonus that it's been made out to be. But some is unconscious, and we have to be careful sometimes at overemphasizing, over signifying some contexts, which may be unconscious selections by writers. And so we have to be critical and evaluative in how we discuss how contexts have shaped texts and what they reveal about the world that we live in. And that's why we want to keep quite a tight focus when we talk about context on the purpose, the writer's intention, the writer's purpose, because then it externalizes the influence of context rather than us making kind of guesses about what's going on inside a writer's mind. And so when we're choosing context, we need to make sure that we apply it effectively. And actually to do that often is to apply caution, to be critical and evaluative. Especially with Shelley, for example, who can't speak for herself about the relevance of context, we have to then not overly apply something and saying she is saying this, and use that very definite tone. We can, in our writing at A level, be hedging. We can be thinking in terms of perhaps critiquing. And I think for both Shelley and Margaret Atwood, it's really important that we don't over exaggerate the importance of biographical context, because it's interesting how frequently we do that with female writers by comparison to male writers, unless we're talking about male minority writers, of course. And with the Edexcel specification, we've got Tennessee Williams, and again, it's really easy for us to go, oh, Tennessee Williams was homosexual, so there's all sorts of stuff about homosexuality in there. With female writers, we often overplace importance on biography, and I'm not saying that there isn't importance on biographical aspects with Mary Shelley and Margaret Atwood, and I'm not saying that the influence of Mary Wollstonecraft or indeed Shelley's relationship with Percy Shelley is not in some ways deeply rooted in the story of Frankenstein. However, that isn't the only context that we want to be discussing. All right, we also then have to be very aware of our own personal bias, and our own personal, perhaps we are led towards the relevance of particular contexts or pushed away from the relevance of particular contexts because of our own personal stories. And I think, again, for those of us that are very interested in history, it's really easy for us to focus on things in history and to make links between the Handmaid's Tale and the Nazi regime in Germany and the oppression of the Polish and of women in Nazi Germany. And actually, while those hints are there, particularly in terms of some of the symbolism, Margaret Atwood isn't telling us about the dangers of Nazi Germany. She's reminding us how totalitarian states come to exist and asking us to look at where we are on the pathway to totalitarianism in our own culture and society. So it's not about Germany, it's not about Nazis, it's not about World War II. It is, in fact, about us and today. And so we have to test our own bias. Again, in terms of looking at religion and understanding how both texts are influenced by religious ideology, religious thinking, we have, again, to be careful of our own personal preferences with regards to that. Both texts allude to but the Bible and to biblical thinking. And it's really easy for us then to apply particular cultural ideology onto the writers or the text themselves. And so it's really easy for us to think that everybody in kind of European in the mid 1800s was deeply religious and, you know, spent all their time praying. And that, of course, isn't the case, and it's not the case today either. And it's really easy for us to assume when we talk about things with like the Christian right and the moral majority in America, that everybody in America is a kind of Bible-bashing zealot. And of course, that isn't all the case either. And so we have to kind of be tentative in the way that we deal with some of these facts and how we express them. All right, so let me remind you, and this may be one of the ones that you want to take a screenshot of all of the parts of context that we have covered with regards to Frankenstein. And this is in not any particular order, but you have information on all of these in your folders. And so you can just go ahead and look at these. The purpose then is to reread them. You do want to know about Mary Shelley's life and Mary Wollstonecraft and her father. You want to look at, again, what were the beliefs and the values and the ideas in the Enlightenment era, and particularly looking at social philosophy and Erasmus Darwin and Galvanism. Then you want to think about how we've looked at some of the kind of social advances in that era. So we looked at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we looked at John Locke, we looked at all sorts of ideas to do with the Gothic. So we looked at Anne Radcliffe and the difference between horror and terror. We looked at the ideas, emerging ideas in Europe in the 1800s to do with how death is treated differently within society and how that influenced how death was presented in art. And then, of course, we've got the intertextual references with Paradise Lost, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, we've got Prometheus, Faustus and the French Revolution. Now, in an essay, the examiner wouldn't expect you to deal with all of these in order. But in the same way, because the text Frankenstein is a big text and it's wide-ranging in its ideas and its events and the things that it deals with, in the same way that you would be expected to show a knowledge of loads of stuff within Frankenstein, you would be expected to deal with a wide range of contexts. So if you're writing me 3 comparative paragraphs, which is what we're aiming with for, what you don't want to do is then have only talked about 3 elements of context. So, you know, Mary Wollstonecraft, Rousseau, and the idea of the kind of social contract and the natural man, and intertextual reference with Paradise Lost. If you only mention those 3, then you're going to show already a very limited understanding of the context. So you're going to, just like you did with the references from the text itself, you're going to want to look at your context in detail again, and you're going to want to think about which elements can I just name check and say, oh yes, of course, and that, you know, that reflects John Locke's idea of the tabula rasa, or you know, that reflects the idea of death being idealized in kind of European culture. And so you kind of name check context, and then which are the context elements that you're going to want to dig into, and I'll talk to you about how you can filter that out and work those out in a minute. All right, so these are the ones for Frankenstein. this is the list for Handmaid's Tale. And of course, the issue with the list for Handmaid's Tale is because it expands, because she critiques, you know, modern America, post-war America, and Europe, and, you know, pretty much every ideology, way of thinking, Western civilization is you know, is touched on in some way. And so this list is not by any way entirely complete, but we've of course got Atwood and her own life, and this idea of the influence of Orwell. Then you've got the dystopian novel, and of course she talks about speculative fiction as well. And then we've got second wave feminism, which I can see here I thought was so important that I've mentioned it twice, and the backlash against it. The religious right, fundamental evangelicalism, we've got the moral majority, and of course that links to Ronald Reagan, the presidential elections in 1980 and 1984. And then we've got all sorts of issues to do with gender roles, sexuality. So you go all the way from, you know, women as housewives through to the contraceptive pill and abortion. Remember, we talked about eugenics. We've got homosexuality. We've got, you know, pornography, all of that stuff, abstinence that we see coming out as kind of ideas in the text. Then we've got the environmental destruction that we've looked at. We've got the rise of fundamentalist Islam. Then we've got more European stuff. So we've got Thatcherism, and we see some of the things there. And then we've got all of the intertextual references. And you'll know, because you've got all of the presentations that we did on the context for Handmaid's Tale, that there's lots more there that we can unpick. And again, you're going to want to think about what's the key ones that you would need to dig into in detail and know really well. And of course, you know, we're looking a lot at the religious right, the moral majority, Ronald Reagan, that drifting towards traditional family values in terms of American politics influencing American society. And then probably on the other side of that, the idea of liberalism. And then which the ones that you can just name check, and we've talked about that in terms of in reference specifically to Ceausescu. All right, so what are the different ways that you can embed context? I'm going to talk you through two different approaches to embedding context before I actually talk you through how you write it in terms of words on the page. So the first one then is what is if you, in terms of your the focus of your paragraph, the big thing that you want to tackle, is it the author's purpose? So is your paragraph really focused on something about the writer's intention and what they're saying about the world and what they're saying about society and what they want their readers to take away? And then if that is the case, then how does the context drive that message? On the other hand, obviously you're always going to be talking about the author's purpose, but actually if your focus is to dig into one of the texts, and it's really to dig into the events and the characters within one of the texts and to show what ideas those deal with, then you're also going to want to think about how the context influenced those things. So we look at it from above and below. The overarching ideas in the text, the writer's intention, what the writer is challenging us as readers to think. Here, that's the overarching ideas. How does the context drive this forward? And then that is turned into the narrative, isn't it? The character, the event, what they say, what they do. And you can also see elements of context within all of those things. And so you're going to kind of take a little bit of both of these at different times in your essay, depending on what you've got to say. All right, so the first one was then the author's purpose. And so maybe the author's purpose is to critique society. Maybe the author's purpose is more specific. It's to highlight the oppression of women. Or maybe it's to explore how violence is used as a form of control. If you're finding that that's where you want to focus, then you're going to want to ask yourself some questions about how is the writer presenting these overarching, these big ideas in a way that shines the light on the world that the reader lives in. And of course, for The Handmaid's Tale, we can talk about that being contemporary society. You know, we are living in a very similar world to the one that Margaret Atwood was living in. For Mary Shelley, you're going to want to talk about readers in the Georgian period in England, or readers in the 1800s in Europe. And so you're going to want to think about what is the kind of the broad scale information about those societies that matches your broad points. Okay? And so you can think about that and think about some of the big picture context that matches the author's purpose, the writer's intention. And like I said, I'm going to show you how you could write that up in a minute. All right. Perhaps then you want to focus in on character and event, something that's said, and you know that that is a particular moment that's been influenced by context. And so we could talk maybe about some of the things that the commander says in The Handmaid's Tale, and how those are particularly influenced by the context of political modern America. So say there's a dramatic, a shocking, or a pivotal event. You're going to ask yourself the question, how does that event, how does that moment reflect ideas in society? How does it support them? How does it subvert them? How does it challenge accepted thinking? And why might that be? Or you might have a character that demonstrates a particular attitude or a particular mindset, or speaks a particular moment. And so we've got characters like Moira, or Offred's mother, or Serena Joy in The Handmaid's Tale, who in themselves signify particular ways of thinking in America that Atwood is also giving us a commentary on. So the whole text is a commentary on modern America. Individual moments are a commentary on specific things in modern America. And then you've got characters that also symbolize particular groupings. And so we want to say, what are the mindsets that are presented and why are they presenting them? So this is something that you have to plan really carefully. And in fact, your context probably takes as much time as planning your AO2. Remember, they're equally weighted. So it's not something you can just kind of tack on the end or deal with really quickly. So I'm going to ask you to have a little practice, and this is going to be probably one of the slides that you're going to want to pause on. So here I've got 4 pieces of contextual information. So it's facts that might be relevant for Frankenstein. But of course, I've not mentioned Frankenstein at all. So what I want you to practice doing is to rewrite each of the context points that I've given you, and to work out how you could link them either to Mary Shelley's purpose, so her idea in writing the novel, or to a specific pivotal event or character. Okay, so you're going to grapple with this information and work out how you could use it to say something specific, Mary Shelley's intention, or link it to an event or character. So pause the video, you can rewrite these 3 and see what you can come up with for Frankenstein. And then on the next slide, we have the same task, but for The Handmaid's Tale. Okay, so this is the one for Handmaid's Tale. Just 3 pieces here, some of them that we've talked about already, and you're going to do the same thing. So you're going to rewrite these pieces of context, and you're going to present them, write them up in a way that links them to something specific in The Handmaid's Tale, specific intention by the writer, or a specific event or character, so that you're practicing dealing with this level of detail. So again, pause the video and then come back and I'm going to show you how you can embed your context into your academic writing. And then the final slide that I've got for you is a few actual sentence starters that you could use for context to get you on your way. All right, so we're nearly there. So here are a few ways that you could structure where the context goes in your essay. And this depends on, like I said before, whether you are wanting to link your context to the writer's purpose, or whether you're wanting to link your context to the specific textual example that you're dealing with. So if you wanted to link your context to the doctor's appointment and the kind of this sort of monthly checkup, then that would be linking it specifically to your textual example. Whereas if you wanted to use something about the moral majority and the kind of rise of populist religious fundamentalism in America, then you might link it more to the writer's purpose. So if you're focusing on the writer's purpose, then this might be the kind of flow that your essay paragraph would have. And this isn't the whole of your essay paragraph, because I'm just giving you the bit here which you would use for one of the specific texts. And then, of course, you would transition onto the other text and you could place your context there depending on what you're discussing, and you don't have to have it in a uniform way. So you're focused on the writer's purpose, the writer's intention. So you've got your comparative paragraph opener, and then you move into whichever text you're talking about, whether it's Frankenstein or the Handmaid's Tale. And of course, as you do that, you're going to be writing about the writer's intention, because that's, you know, what we're front loading our paragraphs with. And then that's where you put your context in. And then you go into your textual examples, and we've talked in the last video about how you can embed those. So that idea that you can name check them, and then you can go add your quotation that you're going to use, and then you go into your AO2 signposted analysis. So this then is, I'm talking about what the writer's purpose is. You know, here's my idea, my comparative idea. Here's where I've said, you know, the second part of your comparative sentence opener, which is where you've said, you know, in The Handmaid's Tale, Atwood does this, whereas in Frankenstein, Mary Shelley does this. Then you decide that you're going to keep talking about Frankenstein, for example. So you go into your discussion about this idea, in your first idea in Frankenstein. You say what Mary Shelley's intention and purpose is, why has she written that idea. Then you do your context, and then after your context you come to your textual examples and you do your analysis. And that works really nicely because it shows that a writer has had their ideas, their thinking, their purpose influenced by whatever was going on in society at the time. The alternative then is where you want to link your context specifically to something that's more in minutiae. It's a detail in the text itself. So it's an event, it's a character, it's a language. And so you would have to have quite a narrow focus on the context. So an example with Frankenstein would be where the creature aligns himself with characters from Paradise Lost. And then you would give your contextual link to Paradise Lost. And, you know, that's a revolutionary text, and why Mary Shelley might be writing in the context of Paradise Lost. Or you could look at something quite small, for example, with the education of Sapphi, in terms of giving her this kind of European language to speak, and then the creature is educated as well. And you could have quite a narrow focus on that moment and link your context specifically to that moment because it matches it very tightly. What doesn't work is you're talking specifically about a moment or something that a character says, and then you make a massive, big, broad context point. So let me give you an example. Victor Frankenstein calls on God and curses the creature and calls him a wretch, and we have this and then we go into some sort of context about religious belief and people believing in good and evil. You can see already that it doesn't work, because the point that you've made is quite narrow and you've jumped to quite a broad overarching context message. So you need to match them quite effectively. So say you are going to focus on events, characters, language. So of course you have the same paragraph opener. You've got your comparative paragraph opener. You move into your first text. You deal with the writer's purpose, what their message is, what they want to say. You move into your textual examples. And then as you do your signposted AO2, and if you go back to the AO2 video, you'll see that lovely expanded AO2 that discusses in detail language, form and structure. In there, you put your specific context links. Okay, because it's all hinged on the specific thing that's happening in the text. All right, so there's a really big beware here. Don't ever finish a paragraph with a context point, because of course context is all about what the writer wants us to learn, whether the writer wants us to learn something that's overarching or something from the detail is always about what the writer wants us to learn. So of course it's very important, if you are putting context towards the end of a paragraph, to always move back to the writer's purpose after you've included it. All right, so I'm not going to read this screen out for you, but these are just some of the ways that you could talk about context, and you know, some sentences that you could use, ways that you could set up your phrasing. So this is really one for you to pause on or screenshot if you want to. You don't have to use these, but this is just to give you a sense of how your context could be linked into your academic writing. And that is it for today's video, and that's the last video on comparative essay writing for Frankenstein the Handmaid's Tale. And of course we will be using the same skills again for our coursework on Fight Club and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. All right, thank you.